I'm delighted to be joined by Brooke Goldstein. We are going to be talking about strategic litigation and the fight against anti-Semitism. Brooke, would you like to start with a real-life case?
Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you for having me. Sure. We have so many cases. I really wouldn't know which one to choose. They're all equally important. We have cases on campus. We have cases off campus in the workplace. We represent students. We represent Israeli companies and people who are discriminated against. And they all really have the same thing going on. You know, the facts are unique, but the one constant is the fact that our clients are being discriminated against because they're Jewish. And then you have a whole range of excuses. So the case I did want to start with, however, is our case against D2 Counseling in Dallas. And I think it really exemplifies the problem that we're facing right now from a societal, systemic root. So we have these two therapists, two Jewish therapists that were representing Miss Younger and Mrs. Katz. And they were fired from their counseling practice because they wanted to talk about Jewish pain and Jewish trauma. And they were told by their boss that this was too political, that talking about the trauma and the victimization of Jews after October the 7th or from rising anti-Semitism actually has nothing to do with Israel, just from rising anti-Semitism and the environment that's happening when they're treating their clients. They want to be able to talk about this. And they brought it up in a meeting and they were immediately fired. And the claim that this is politicized, that this is victimizing the other, is really an erasure of the Jewish identity. And that's what's happening right now. And what I find unique about this case, but also constant in every single one of the litigations that we're involved in, is that a civil rights issue where Jews are being treated differently because they're Jewish, they're being told they don't matter, their pain doesn't matter, that you can discriminate against them. It gets mixed up in politics, right? So the excuse here is, well, I'm offended by Israel's actions or the Israel-Palestine debate, and this is political. Therefore, we can treat you differently, or we don't have to listen to what you're saying. And this is a real systemic issue. And unfortunately, I don't think it's one that we can just solve through litigation. We have to change hearts and minds. And it's very hard to do that. We're in an environment where we're seeing just now blood libels being spread through the media, such as the famine blood libel that I hope we can get into and dissect point by point. And it's these blood libels that are playing on the emotions, the human emotions of compassion for children, compassion for people, that's now politicized for a pro-Hamas agenda. It's these blood libels that allows dozens of people in a Milan cafe to attack a 6-year-old child and his father simply because he's wearing a kippah and tzitzit, attacking Jews for being Jews, screaming free Palestine, pretending this is a political issue. It's these blood libels that, lead to Jewish children being kicked off a plane. These are not IDF soldiers. They're Jewish children from France being kicked off a plane and having to witness the violent, unlawful takedown, under the guise of an arrest for the disturbance. What was the disturbance? Jews being Jews, singing songs. And so these cases, even though we're dealing with them from a legal perspective, and each one is unique, and we're setting precedents in courts, and we're entering into groundbreaking settlements like we just did with Columbia University, for example, are just one step. We need a cultural shift to really understand what is Jew hatred? Why does this disease infect us? Why does it come in ebbs and flows? And what can we do to stop it?
Yeah, it strikes me that litigation efforts can take different forms. So ordinary litigation, often what you're trying to do is assist a particular client in need. And strategic litigation, you're trying to set a principle or send a message. And so what strikes me about your case is that those particular therapists who are discriminated against obviously deserve redress, but that you want to send a signal, which is that Jews shouldn't be treated through a different standard and that you want that entrenched in law. I imagine, for example, that after the killing of George Floyd, a number of Black people would have said that they found that horrific and that they saw it as racialized and that they were concerned about the ill treatment of Black people by racist police officers, and that if they wanted to talk about that in a therapy session, that wouldn't have been seen as too political or beyond the pale. And so there's a worry when different groups are treated differently, when some people's pain matters and other people's pain doesn't. And so I applaud the involvement in that. The other thing that you talked about is this idea of changing the culture. And so you're involved in the end Jew hatred movement, and the idea of having a ground roots movement which says there is something dangerous about vilifying people who are Jewish, that there is a long history of it. You've mentioned blood libels before, and there's a history of Jewish persecution, for millennia, and being able to identify that and change people's hearts and minds is important. And it seems that there's a relationship that happens with litigation, because on the one hand, the litigation provides a stage to address the issue, to highlight something like the hatred of Jews, but also that stage needs to happen under fertile soil where you've got a community that's willing to hear that. And so having the ground roots movement seems important.
Yeah, absolutely. So just going back to the first thing you said, so we operate a public interest law firm and litigation fund, a Jewish civil rights litigation fund. And you're right. There's so many examples of anti-Jewish discrimination, but because we're a nonprofit, we are bound to take those cases which, representing that client serves in the public interest. So we're looking at cases where we're representing students or one or two students at one university, but what they have experienced is a systemic, and the redress that they are seeking obviously is to compensate them for their harm, but systemic change is key. And that's why also I think, there's two ways to go about this. You can file a lawsuit and you can settle it, and you can file a lawsuit and you can litigate it. And so there's pros and cons to each. Just speaking generally, the types of things that you can get through a settlement agreement, you can't necessarily get through a court of law. Well, you might get a precedent that has its deterrent effect. And, there are certain cases where questions are novel and new. Is anti-Zionism really the same as anti-Jewish discrimination, right? And so there is value to setting precedents in those areas. But in other cases, particularly with campus cases, and we've settled some of them for significant change and significant monetary compensation as well. You're getting the policies that you need change. One of the most significant campus cases we have right now ongoing is Carnegie Mellon University, where we represent the student Yael Kanan, and she was just subjected to a campaign of anti-Semitic abuse and then retaliation, and the school refused to take appropriate action. Well, it turns out also Carnegie Mellon University happens to be allegedly the third largest recipient of money from Qatar, a hostile foreign government, as far as I'm concerned, regardless of the fact that they host soccer games, to soccer wash, whatever you want to call it. The fact that they're now, I guess, that Iran is in the tubes, the number one state sponsor of the Hamas terrorist group. And, this case is so important because what role does foreign funding play? And obviously, we think an outsized role and influence when you're making grants of $800 million to a school. And it's shown that anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism has risen 300% in the schools that receive foreign funding, particularly from Qatar. And how do we address that, not just through the legal system, but there has to be a parallel legislative initiative. And that's not really in our hands. It's not the role of civil society. Our clients can do what they can do, and we're operating on a nonprofit budget. But lawmakers need to look at this. We need to understand what America is all about if we're accepting foreign funding into our media and into our campuses, and we see the direct results of that. The other thing in terms of the cultural stuff, it just amazes me all the time how everything that we're going through is politicized. And what we've done with the End-Jew hatred movement is galvanized unity around the idea that Jew hatred is a civil rights issue. In fact, it's the greatest civil rights issue of our time. It is not a political issue. It's not about foreign policy. It's about a minority community, particularly here in the United States, that deserve equal treatment and equal protection under the law and the Constitution of the United States. And this is basic. And that's why, for example, when President Trump, during his first term, issued an executive which expanded Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 so that it applied to religion, could also apply to Jewish students on campus. The pushback was entirely political. It was all about Palestine, free Palestine. How is this going to affect our ability to advocate for Palestine. It's not the same, and the continued, the mixing of the two as though a Jewish person does not deserve equal protection and civil rights because that would somehow impede on their ability to advocate for Hamas. When you look at the campuses, they're not being impeded. We're trying to, arrest and deport Mahmoud Khalil for being the chief negotiator for the pro-Hamas movement on campus, and he looks pretty fine on CNN filing his lawsuits, and they're occupying campuses unlawfully, engaging in massive civil rights violations. But as soon as a Jewish student says, I deserve to go to campus, or I deserve to go to school and not be impeded, or, not get assaulted, physically assaulted on the way to school, two of our clients, Max and Michael, there's today a press conference and a rally in support for justice. We're beaten up on campus in front of the students, in front of the campus security. And so the intimidation that Jews cannot enforce their civil rights because it's too political or it's violating the free speech rights of the pro-Palestinian camp, frankly, is a load of BS. You see it with your own eyes, and it's a way to intimidate us into not standing up for ourselves. And that's why, it used to be, I call it a pre-October 7th and post-October 7th mentality. It was very difficult to get Jewish students and professors and people to really stand up for themselves in courts of law. But now I think the Jewish community has woken up and seen that if they don't stand up for themselves, if they don't get out in the street, if they don't take on the responsibility of what you said, grassroots mobilization, you cannot rely on these big bucks Jewish organizations to solve the problem. We have to motivate and activate every single Jewish person and our allies now on the street in a grassroots fashion, because this is the greatest civil rights issue of our lifetime. I think, we are at a turning point. We see what's happening on the street. And I truly believe that we can end Jew hatred in our lifetime if the Jewish community is unified with our allies, and we ensure consequences for the behavior that we don't want to see through grassroots mobilization and impact litigation. That is the formula that can work, especially in the United States. That is the formula that has been used by every single minority rights group in this country. It is not the same to be Black as it was even 20, 30 years ago. It's not the same to be a woman in the workforce. It's not the same to be gay. Now is the time for equal rights for Jews as well.
So I've got a couple of thoughts. The one is that you mentioned all these different civil rights groups that have changed the landscape in America culturally and also legally. And there hasn't really been a Jewish civil rights movement before, but there have been Jews involved in many civil rights movements. And I imagine that after October 7th, a lot of them sort of looked at their allies in, let's say, the LGBTI movement or, Black Lives Matter, and they said, well, now we've been attacked, will you support us? And not only were they told we will not support you, but in fact, what you had was a rebuke and a sort of massive rise in anti-Semitism. I wonder if the idea of allyship has backfired badly, and whether actually a lot of these groups don't have each other's interests at heart, and that there are tensions underneath them that make them incompatible as movements, and also why you think Jews have been thrown under the bus so badly in America.
So I don't think allyship failed as an idea. I think what happened was we dropped the ball in the sense that our narrative. So there is this tactic that you can use called the mirror image strategy, right? The mirror image, where you accuse your enemy of what you're guilty of, right? Or you adopt somebody else's story, so you refute and erase their identity. So the whole story of the Jewish people, that we are a minority community, that we have been subjected to colonialism, apartheid, genocide, that we are indigenous to our homeland, which was taken away from us. We still haven't been granted full rights to a state. Is that the Jewish story or is that the Palestinian story, right? This is the Jewish story historically, right? The Palestinian identity as an exclusive Muslim identity to challenge legally the status of Jews to self-sovereignty was invented in the 1970s by Yasser Arafat. Then you had their whole lawfare tactic to use in the international courts. So the whole problem, though, is that they took our narrative that they are a minority subjected to genocide and went to other minority groups and created an allyship based on this false narrative that the Palestinians are like the Blacks in America, in the 30s and 40s, when the opposite is true. The Jews were the ones who were the dhimmis. The Jews are the second-class citizens. The Jews were the ones subjected to pogroms and kicked out of Iran and Iraq and so forth. violently. And, the most bizarre of all I have to say is the alliance, I do not understand, of the gay rights movement, the LGBTQIA plus movement. It's just so obviously bizarre on its face. I can't even logically, draw the lines there. But we dropped the ball on the number one most important thing, is that we share the threat. It's not about shared victimization, but we shared the threat. And the threat is radicalization. And in particular, the threat is theological radicalization, radical Islam. And you see right now what's happening to Christians in Nigeria. And the Pope does not say anything. You have Christians, hundreds of men, women, and children being slaughtered throughout Nigeria as we speak right now on this podcast, locked into churches, burned alive in churches. And the Pope criticizes that the yard of a church, somewhere, I think it was in Gaza, the West Bank, I can't even remember, was scorched. But there are people burning alive, and nobody dare criticizes radical Islam. Or what's happening right now to the Druze in Syria. Horrific. And only the Israelis, only the IDF sent. I just spoke to a colleague who is now in Syria trying to protect the Jewish community, fighting, risking their life, just like they do in Gaza, fighting off the same Islamist terrorists to protect the Jewish community. The minority allyship around the victimization, we lost that, and we dropped the ball because we were too afraid to talk about radical Islam. And that was the product of a very strategic lawfare attack to silence free speech about these issues. And as free speech was silenced and we were too intimidated to talk about female genital mutilation and Boko Haram and ISIS, and unable to create real partnerships based on shared narratives, there opened up a space for an immense amount of propaganda that painted the Jewish state and the Jewish people, the greatest historical, oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history, as the Nazi. It's that flip. Again, taking our Holocaust and flipping it and accusing us being Nazis. And this is the number one narrative that we face right now that has to be overturned. And the only way to do that is to be able to have the courage and the truth to spread the fact. So instead, for example, of going to campus and training students how to be on the defense and defend Israel against apartheid charges or BDS and, constantly be arguing within the paradigm of your enemy on the defense, with an enemy who lies and manipulates international law and manipulates facts. All of our efforts, whether on campus or otherwise, should be towards raising awareness about the real genocides and the real human rights violations that are happening, calling out the hypocrisy, and forcing our institutions and using litigation and using the media to make sure that those who fund and support radicalism, both outside and within our borders, are held accountable. And so I cannot speak so much to the international community. And, we can talk about the question of the validity and the efficacy of international tribunals and so on. But at least in the United States, there has to be an effort to stop the radicalization that is infesting here and spreading harmful theological ideas that lead to violence.
So one reason why you might have had these ideas spread is that America has typically been a porous society in a few ways. So the one is that it's welcoming of a variety of different nations into its borders, a variety of different cultures and ideas. And the other one is that American universities, which I suppose are the training ground for a lot of elites, have had an approach of saying, well, we should let all voices be present, including those voices that once they gain power will suppress. So I would imagine on a campus, it would be quite hard to express a pro-Israel view, whereas, pushing a sort of pro-Palestine view would be quite easy. And so it's not because universities start off that way. They might have said, let's hear both sides. And then the one side managed to capture the institution. So, those in a certain kind of ideological alliance marched through the institutions, gained them, for power, and you kind of have a bit of a pushback going now, where the Trump administration has said, "Well, we're very concerned about the rising anti-Semitism. We don't owe these institutions our investment." So, the moves against Harvard and Columbia, for example, to say you're going to have, this kind of hate mongering on your campus. Well, as an investor, we don't have to, invest with you. We can go and invest with other universities, those that are willing to protect their students. I wonder about, you mentioned the sort of free speech issue, and there's a complication of this. I mean, my legal practice is built around this line of free speech and hate speech and working out where you ought to limit speech. And one of the cases that I've cited in court is the Skokie, Illinois case. So in the 70s, you had a group of American neo-Nazis who wanted to march in a town that was not only a very Jewish town, but a town lived in by many survivors of the Holocaust. They wanted to do it in full Nazi regalia, Gestapo outfits and swastikas in tow. And, the Jewish community was outraged and wanted to stop the march. And the American Civil Liberties Union took the view that the march must go ahead on the basis that if we create a precedent which denies the Nazi speech, eventually that precedent will be turned against Jews. And so they took a very principled stance. Ultimately, what happened was that the march didn't go ahead because the community sort of, came out in full force, and the few pathetic Nazis were too cowardly to face the community. But that principle has sort of always stuck with me, that there's a reason why you might want to, allow for lots of free speech and also allow for some hateful speech, because it gives you free information. So when you have people on campuses waving Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags, it tells you there's a problem here that needs to be combated. And if people were not free to wave those hateful symbols around, you might not know about the genuine issue, and you might drive the problem underground.
Yeah.
From a strategic level, how do you do that balance where you care about protecting Jewish interests, and in doing that, you might allow lots of bigots to sort of express their view?
Right, but because we're not talking about speech, we're talking about action. And this is what always happens, is when we talk about action that targets Jewish students, or action even now that's pro-terror, everyone screams free speech, right? So you're occupying a campus illegally. You're physically engaging in trespass. You are defacing public property. You are physically assaulting students. You are disturbing lectures, you name it, all actions preventing Jews and our allies from speaking. And then as soon as there's a pushback saying your actions are unlawful, which they are, your rights stop where my rights begin. This is all law school 101 stuff, okay? They cry free speech, because they want to muddle the debate. Nobody that I know who has a law degree is confused as to what the Constitution of the United States protects in terms of free speech. But confusion only sets in and things get, gray instead of black and white when Jews are involved. Because what they say is that we're protesting Palestine, and if you enforce your civil rights, it'll impede my ability to protest, which is not. We have time, place, manner restrictions in the United States. You can march if you're a Nazi. You're free. If all Mahmoud Khalil did was stand on the corner and hold a sign saying, I love Hamas, I don't think he would, might not be deported. Okay, but this is a guy who is the mastermind, negotiator, chief extorter, I would call it, for the pro-Hamas groups who were using unlawful tactics to pressure a school to cave on certain points. And there was, I would argue, he is a co-conspirator in a criminal activity that intentionally targeted, and it wasn't just Jews. There were two black janitors who were in a hall at Columbia who were beaten, and this is lawlessness. Right. And it's right in front of your eyes. You cannot deny what's happening in front of your eyes. And yet we like to then sit back in our ivory towers and say, well, let's debate free speech. That is a ruse. All right. We've written tons of books. This is not a free speech issue. This is an issue of enforcing our immigrations and customs law. It is an issue of the rights of the federal government to deport people who are engaged in unlawful conspiracies to commit crime. And it's about, enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Law to apply equally to Jewish students. So people want to now divert us into a debate about free speech, which I think is irrelevant and a bit of a ruse right now, because, the type of injunction relief that our clients are seeking is very basic, right? The right to attend class without being punched in the face. This is not a debate about free speech.
Yeah, I think it's important to be able to draw that distinction between speech and action. And as you say, you can regulate the way protests occur by saying in these areas at these times in this manner, without necessarily regulating the content of the ideas. What's the view on providing different rules for foreign students? So when I've visited America, one of the things that I'll be asked is, are you have you ever been a member of the Nazi Party, and are you part of a terrorist organization? And so, I say no. Now, it might be that as an American, you, as a citizen, have more ability to, let's say, have an affinity for some of these despicable groups than a foreign student. So when the American government sort of says, well, these people are going to be deported, are they acting in a manner that's unequal, or are they merely enforcing their rules?
If you are outside the country of the United States, if you're a foreigner versus being a foreigner inside the country, it's two completely different things. So if you are someone who is not an American citizen, you're a foreigner, you're outside the country and you want to come in, you're seeking a visa, you have zero right to come into the United States. The United States can exclude you for whatever reason it wants. Okay. It can ask you, what is your view of Hamas? And if you say, I support Hamas, we view it as a terrorist group, we have every right to prevent you from entering into our country. You have no free speech right to support Hamas and enter into the United States. That has to be clear. It's obvious, but it has to be clear. Once you come into this country, though, the question is exactly that when it comes to deportation proceedings. And that's why I think the strongest argument that the government has to deport someone like Mahmoud Khalil rests on his actions, not his speech. And there are plenty of actions that he's done. Now, if you are like I said, we'll take these basic examples, just standing on the street corner holding a pro-Hamas sign, right? And you come to the attention of the U.S. government and the immigration authorities, and they look into you and they say, actually, you lied on your visa application. You said that, you weren't connected to Hamas, but actually your uncle is a member of Hamas and he's the one paying you money to stand on the street here. And they also say, there's a couple other things that you've done here. They have every right to deport you. But I haven't seen, and I don't think deportations based merely on pure free speech, I don't think that's the strongest argument.
So there's been much talk of a two-state solution for decades. And I think visiting Israel a while ago, it sort of occurred to me that it's a strange fantasy because you have, Hamas ruling Gaza, which is physically separated from the West Bank, run by Fatah, and that the two organizations don't like each other very much at all. What is a way of resolving the conflict? I mean, this is sort of a tough question to ask, but it seems that the goals of the Israeli government are to eradicate Hamas, release the hostages.
Why is it the responsibility of the Jews to build a Palestinian state? At what point do they take self-responsibility? Everyone uses this term two-state solution, which is so bizarre, right? Creating another Islam state, as we did, we tried that in Gaza, right? It's not a solution to anything to create a Palestinian Islamist state run by, instead of Hamas, Islamic Jihad. We're going to see exactly what you see in Gaza. And you have to be just historically so ignorant. We had a two-state solution. It's called Jordan, right? The original plan was for Israel to include Transjordan, and the Arabs said no. And so Israel was divided in half. You have a Hashemite king now ruling in Jordan. That was the two-state solution. And now they just want to continue, to carve it up. And ultimately, we're stupid. We're playing Monopoly when we should be playing chess. This is an ideology that we're fighting. And it's an ideology that isn't just restricted to the so-called Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is just a bunch of proxies of the real, puppet masters, which is Iran and Qatar. Which is why the Abraham Accords and the normalization is so significant, because when these countries who are not secular countries are able to have a theology that is compatible with coexistence with non-Islamist states, coexistence with the Jewish state, coexistence with Western democracies, and to interact, in a geopolitical level without radical Islamist ideology, jihadism taking place, that's the future. Right? That's how civilized society operates. But as long as the ideology of radical Islam persists, is continued to be taught in schools. I made a movie that was released in 2006, an award-winning documentary film, where I documented children who are being taught in their schools, in their textbooks, in their kindergartens, and their television programs to seek jihad, to kill themselves for the sake of jihad, They're being recruited as child soldiers. If this doesn't stop, right, these children are going to grow up and they're going to be the future jihadis. And if we continue to turn a blind eye to the Islamist genocide in Nigeria, to the Islamist genocide in Syria, if we continue to be silent, if the world continues to be silent about this mass murder and genocide, because they want to accuse Israel of what these Islamist groups are guilty of, they will only become empowered. That is obvious.
As a South African, we had to endure this spectacle of Team South Africa being on the global stage fighting for justice in the similar way to our sports teams like the Springboks sort of taking home the cup. And so the general coverage of the ICJ litigation in South Africa was very one-sided. So you would have multiple reports from mainstream news saying that South Africa had won its case, that the Israelis had been found liable for genocide, when in fact no such thing had occurred. I wondered what your thoughts were as a lawyer about that litigation and whether it has been run in a proper manner or not.
So my position that I stated in my op-ed, I think is clear. I think Israel should not have participated. I think the whole thing was a farce. And I wonder, I know that Israel's participation really, brought more media attention to it. You can't take the position that a court is illegitimate and doesn't have jurisdiction and then, show up and argue before it as though you're asking their permission to do something. And the lawfare tactics, right, just keep coming. It was the ICJ before it was the ICC, and it's the war crimes charges against Israeli officials and Netanyahu, and back then Ariel Sharon. They can't even land in London out of fear of an arrest warrant. The whole international system has become so politicized, and that's why I mentioned earlier, you can debate even, the efficacy and the need and the legitimacy of these so-called international courts. There's a problem of jurisdiction. The United States can never accede to jurisdiction of an international court. It's in our Constitution. The Supreme Court is the law of the land, as it should be. But then how do you hold these dictatorships accountable? Well, the question still remains, because no dictatorships are really ever held accountable. It hasn't worked. It's a farce. And so because it's, just so neutered, it's been used as this lawfare tool now to pervert international law and to go after democracies who are fighting on an asymmetric battlefield against terrorists that use civilians as human shields. And they know that they have the support of foreign-funded NGOs that are going to come in. They're going to completely ignore the fact that they're using the children and the women in the hospitals as human shields, and they're going to focus their reports entirely on the fact that the hospital was bombed, pervert international law, and again, divert attention away from the real issue, which is the spread of radicalism and these ideologies. And democracies are ill-equipped to fight on the asymmetric battlefield. We're ill-equipped to fight against people who are suicidal and homicidal, right? After 9/11, I remember I was invited to U.S. CENTCOM, and because I had this experience filming, I had over 90 hours of firsthand interviews with leaders of Islamist terror organizations explaining to me how they recruit children as suicide homicide bombers. And we didn't understand the ideology, right? We were asking ourselves, well, why do they hate us so much? What led them to, kill so many civilians and kill themselves in the process? We can't understand that with our Western minds, right? We can't understand a mother holding up a picture of her son with a suicide belt saying, I'm proud of him. And so, that's the wrong question. It's not what have we done to create this hate. It's why are they teaching their kids to hate life and to love death? And then, at what point do we allow our systems, our legal systems now to be abused by those very parties that are fighting against our way of life? So it's all part, you have the media attack, you have the lawfare attack, you have the blood libels, we have now the radicalization on campuses. We're really in a war right now, a multi-front war. And at a critical turning point. I don't know how else to emphasize this. And I'm concerned for the health and the future, particularly of my country, the United States of America. Israel, frankly, I'm less concerned because I think it knows what it stands for and knows what it has to do. And the Jewish people have survived thousands of years. And this is another existential threat, but this time we have a state to protect us. We have an army. And so it's really the job of us in the diaspora, who aren't just allies of the Jewish state, but allies of the free world and Western democracy and truth and morality and the rule of law, to understand that whatever precedents are set against Israel on that battlefield will be used against us as well, other democracies, because we are also on this battlefield, whether it's in we're Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. Right now, Israel is fighting the world's battle, but it's not going to continue to do that. It doesn't have the resources to do that, right? Right now, Israel is redirecting resources to defend its own civilians on a 2-year ongoing war to help the Druze community in Syria. And, what I heard from my colleague in Syria on the ground there is so horrific, so horrific. The world needs to come to Israel's side. The goal of the lawfare attacks is to deter other Western democracies from engaging on the battlefield with us. The goal of the lawfare attacks against free speech is to deter the media and civil society from supporting our governments and officials who are going against radicalism and Islam. And we've got to fight back against this. And that's why I'm really, really proud, to be the founder and executive director of the Lawfare Project, which is the world's foremost Jewish civil rights public interest law firm and litigation fund. We're on the front lines of fighting against lawfare and enforcing civil rights of minority communities around the world. And also, I'm very proud to be one of the leaders of the End Jew Hatred movement, which is historically unprecedented, which has really mobilized Jewish communities around the world to have wins and engage in real meaningful change.
Well, Brooke, I want to say it was an absolute delight having you on the show, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing, internationally and raising the issue. It's been of immense comfort to South African Jews who I think have felt increasingly isolated, and your visit to South Africa was very nourishing for the soul.
It was nourishing for my soul. It was one of the best trips of my adult life, and I'm incredibly grateful for the hospitality of the South African community. Thank you.